So if you're ready to go, Liam, we can get started. You ready? Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to our second speaker in our series for ethics and leadership at New Mexico Tech. So this series of speakers engages our community on contemporary ethical issues that require strong leadership, careful moral deliberation, and intentional attempts to take our social responsibilities seriously. These series of talks are made to prompt our community to think how we can change our lives and act more to promote the common good. And this series is funded and supported by William Henderson, who's here. Thanks, Bill, for coming along. It's hosted by the class department at New Mexico Tech, the Communications, Liberal Arts, and Social Sciences department, and hosted by me, Chris Joglock, Assistant Professor of Ethics. So I'm happy to see you all here. Everyone is welcome to attend and invited to participate afterwards. And you can find recordings of our talks on our YouTube channel. This will be recorded as well. So just a couple of notes before I introduce the talk about format. So this will be about a 45-minute talk that afterwards will be followed by a Q&A. Dr. Bright has asked that you hold the questions for the end, and then you can either raise your hand or type them in the chat afterwards, and then we'll have a nice question session. So today's talk is titled, "Why Does Scientific Fraud Happen, and What Can We Do About It?" Our speaker is Dr. Liam Kofi Bright. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics. His research interests include the social study of scientific knowledge, Africana philosophy, and formal philosophy. And recently, for his impressive research as of late, he was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for research of international repute. And I was just talking with Liam, and he said actually what got him into philosophy initially was his parents, who would have very engaging conversations about leftist politics when he was little. And so this should be a really interesting talk. I hope you all enjoy it. And if you will just briefly, I think you can unmute yourselves. I'm not positive. If you can unmute yourself, if you'll join me in an applause to welcome our speaker.
Okay, thanks everyone. Hi, I'm Liam or Kofi, as was just said. I can't see any of you, so if you sort of try and send me signals about what I just said via your facial reaction, I won't get it. And you know, on the whole, I'm pretty happy about that. So that's fine by me. Also, I should say, I find giving Zoom talks very nerve-wracking and scary, and that means you have to be nice to me. That's what that means. Okay, so just a bit about who I am and what I do. So you know, there's a sort of traditional split between the humanities and the scientists and the sciences, and where sort of humanists try and bring a sort of broader perspective to events, but perhaps use less rigorous methods, and scientists try and use sort of exact methods to come to definite conclusions. And for most of my work, you know, I put myself squarely in the middle. That's my Twitter profile pic. I really like it. It's kind of stylish, right? But so I mentioned most of my work, I try and sort of like place myself in the middle there and try and sort of use the exact methods, sort of mathematical methods from the sciences to sort of address the kind of broad questions which humanists are interested in. But today's talk is a little bit different because another one of my interests, one of the things I do is I focus more on sort of historical philosophy, and in particular, I focus on work by various figures from sort of Africa or the African diaspora, and especially relevant for this talk, W.B. Du Bois, who was a 19th and 20th century sociologist in America, very accomplished. You might have read his book, The Souls of Black Folk. It's very famous. And he thought a lot about misleading scientific work, like what's going on there and why it happens. And I've sort of turned to his work as a, because he's a sort of serious both sociological thinker and also ethical thinker, to try and work out what's going on when we see scientific fraud, and how can we avoid it, because it's I think it's of some intrinsic ethical importance that that science, this source of knowledge which guides so much in our society, be done accurately and honestly. And what's more, I even think the recent times, I mean, just because the nature of a pandemic it means our governance and our scientific research are become so intertwined. It's really highlighted the importance of scientific work being honest. And I'm actually going to discuss a case where I think many people involved in science communication around COVID overstepped the line. So that's a teaser for later. But the general topic I'm going to be drawing on Du Bois's work for is scientific fraud. And so here's the sort of, the pitch for why there's something odd about the phenomena of scientific fraud. This is a quote from Karl Popper. Karl Popper founded the London School of Economics department. I'm contractually obliged to mention him once per talk. I've done it now, they can't fire me. So, Karl Popper said, "It is not the possession of knowledge or of irrefutable truth that makes the man of science, but his persistent and reckless critical quest for truth." So somewhat outdated gendered language aside, what he's saying there is, what the kind of person who becomes a scientist, the kind of person a scientist is, what makes them a scientist, is that they're trying to get at what's true. And this is a pretty typical picture of like what motivates scientists: curiosity, basically, a will to inquire into how the world is. And that's not even just as dreamy as it seems. Like for many scientists, if you have an advanced degree in chemistry or in physics, then I guarantee you could be making more money doing something else than going into academic science. And so if you've chosen to dedicate your life to research, like pure research in its own sake, it seems like you can't be that materially motivated, at least. And a natural guess at why that would seem worth it to you is because you're curious, because you just want to discover how things are. But if that's our model of the kind of people who are scientists, that it's filtering for extreme curiosity, for extreme will to get at the truth in this way, it's puzzling as to how and why fraud would occur, where fraud seems to be, it's the opposite of the quest for truth. It's deliberately introducing lies or misinformation or things you believe to be false into the kind of information sphere of science. And so fraud kind of stands out, and it's what caught my attention about it. It was one of the things that caught my attention about it, is it stands out as just an oddity. Like, if you're gonna lie, why do this thing at all? Why not take your physics degree and go work for a bank? You'll make more money, then you won't have to worry about lying. Well, you'll lie, in the way bankers do. So that was, so there's something kind of interesting about fraud, and that got my attention about it. And it has downstream effects too. So this is a headline from 2018 about a famous, now infamous former food scientist. He was in the American Ivy League. I believe he was at Columbia. I'm not sure about that. He was Brian Wansink, and he carried out experiments on how people, so nutritional psychology, how people would respond to various scenarios where you put food of various sorts in front of them. And some of these experiments you might have heard of. So for instance, one of the things he claimed was basically the people will just eat what's in front of them until the plate is empty, or until the bowl is empty. And so you can get people to eat more or less just by putting a different amount on the plate, because that sets their expectations about how much they're meant to eat. And so he did this experiment where the bottomless bowl experiment, where people were drinking soup from a bowl, but some people actually, the bowl was continually refilling from the bottom, and they would just keep going, until the point of nausea, because they wanted to finish the bowl. And he had lots of sort of eye-catching experiments like this. Another one was you'll do more expensive shopping when you're hungry. And the thing about this is he made the results up, and sometimes just inventing data, but more often by engaging what's called p-hacking, where he more or less just sort of like tortured the data until something or another came out of it, and then he would rush to publish whatever correlations he could find in a way which is sort of statistically spurious. It was very unlikely that he was tracking real phenomena in the world. Or if he was picking up real phenomena, it's kind of a coincidence. His experiments don't tell us that. And so, he eventually was discovered. In fact, kind of interesting, he kind of outed himself, but it seems that sometimes he didn't realize some of what he was doing would be considered bad. And he wrote a blog post called "The Grad Student Who Never Said No." And it was about this like wonderful student who he kept asking them to sort of torture the data to get results, and they would just do it. And it was great because he gets so many publications. But when the rest of the scientific community read that, they weren't very impressed, and that was the end of Brian Wansink, because it sort of prompted investigations, found there's a whole pattern of misbehavior here. So here's a case where you have someone who seems to have been knowingly doing things to enter misinformation in some cases. In other cases, not quite that, but certainly deliberately torturing his data, as I said. And when he was discovered, it led to a credibility crisis in food science. It wasn't just bad for him. It led to a whole range of articles about how much can we trust nutritional science, people sort of saying they felt betrayed, they know what to believe, etc. And so it seems that fraud is not only a puzzle, but it's of some public import, because it's important for science to play the kind of public role that we want it to play, that it be trusted, that it be the kind of thing which people are willing to take actions based upon. Now, that's assuming it's going well. And if things like that in nutritional science aren't reliable, we don't want people to act on this basis. But sometimes, in climate science, for instance, plausibly, we do want people to take actions on the basis of this because we are pretty confident it's reliable. And things which undermine the trust or credibility in science as a public institution seem troubling from that perspective. And so that's another sort of a broader social ethical point of view, which makes fraud important. So, and finally, one more thing. So finally, this is such bad resolution. And I think I've used this very image before and said to myself, gosh, Liam, this is such bad resolution. You should get a better image. And then I didn't. I don't know why. It's late. You're not allowed to be mean to me. Anyway, okay. So then there's been this thing, the replication crisis, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. This mainly hit psychology or social psychology, especially in terms of the public image, but actually has come up in behavioral economics, has come up in medical research, actually, especially cancer research, and it's come up in neuroscience really badly, where there's been a bunch of results which we thought were well established, which it was just found when we try and replicate them a few years later, they don't hold up, even though these things often had been the basis of public policy interventions. And so the famous example was this, the power pose research, which had it that you should stand like this. And I can't see if you can see me. I hope that makes sense to you. And if you do that, it will up your confidence before you engage in sort of high pressure, short time frame scenarios, like important meetings or making important presentations, like this one, for instance. And that was then sold to people as a thing you should do. And this sort of hilarious phenomenon in Britain of what's called the Tory power pose, where I think it was 2016 or 2017, all of the Tory leadership at the conference, they would all walk out onto the stage and stand like that for a while. Oh, you can see my jogging bottoms. But yeah, that sort of cringe behavior, it spread from social psychology into the real world, insofar as the Tory party conference is the real world. And, this was all on the basis of science, which didn't hold up, which seems, again, to have been subject to, if not deliberate fraud, then behaviors which are on the edge of fraud, like selectively omitting data points if they were inconvenient, or doing that kind of data torturing, or failing, if not quite fraud, failing to do things which are good things. For instance, often these subjects, that either hadn't been replicated, no one had even tried to check if they were true after they'd made the big splashy publication, or when they had been replicated, journals hadn't been willing to publish them. So that's not quite fraud, but it's certainly some kind of failure of the scientific incentive system, or the failure of scientists to behave in the way we think they should behave if they're to take up this public role. And so, that's another thing which has been very high profile, and I think, again, has contributed to damaging the trust. It's not just an individual, particularly bad performer like Brian Wansink, but it's been kind of systematic in many, many fields. And I named a few, but I should say, basically, those are just the fields where we've looked hardest for replication. My suspicion is that we'll find a replication crisis when we look one, because there are many, many fields where these problems have been endemic. And so, yeah, there are all these problems. And so what I'm going to do in this talk was what it says there. I'm going to first walk through a popular theory of why fraud occurs. And I'm going to use that historical research from W.E.B. Du Bois to motivate a proposal about what to do. So Du Bois sort of thought we should organize science in a very different way, along very different lines. And he therefore proposed solutions because he was also worried about scientific fraud and the loss of public trust in science. Then I'm going to angst because it's not clear Du Bois is right. I think there are some reasons to worry about Du Bois's proposal, and the reasons are kind of interesting ones. And then I'll conclude with a stirring note that inspires students to go out and solve those problems themselves. I was told this talk should be for the youth, and so that's like for the youth. You have to make the world's problems better. I was young once. I don't miss it. Okay, so what's the popular theory of why fraud occurs? So the popular theory for why fraud occurs is based on what's called the credit economy model of science, or the credit-seeking theory of scientific behavior. And this is an understanding of scientific behavior which goes back a long way. I mean, you can actually kind of see origins of it kind of in Adam Smith even, but certainly really took off in the 20th century under the sociologist Robert Merton, who was and his student Harriet Zuckerman or Zuckerberg, whichever one of those isn't the Facebook guy. So what they found, what they studied was scientific motivations, why they do what they do, trying to explain scientific controversies and what would lead to scientists becoming agitated. And they found that in general, scientists are very motivated by credit, prestige, honor amongst their peers. Scientists really want to sort of look good to their peers. They want other scientists to think they're impressive. And to do that, they need to be seen to be successful in scientific endeavors in certain kind of ways. And it's not just that this is intrinsically desirable for scientists, but it is. I mean, I think anyone who's an academic will know, like, being given, I gave this talk, right? And at the beginning, it was normal to list my accomplishments, list that I just recently won an award. Academics like that, like people work for that sense of being valued, and you'll get the community will like give you that kind of esteem, that kind of honor if you're in the right place. But it can also be materially rewarded. I mean, there is some link to material things here, just in virtue of, just in order to get a job. I mean, how do we decide who gets a job in academia? Well, largely we go on this kind of loose sense of how impressive a person is. So to like stay in the game, to be given a stable career, the kind of material security you need to do science, and when I say science, I mean sort of academic inquiry more broadly. To be given the kind of position you need to do that, you need to be seen as impressive, and so it helps you remain an academic, remain a scientist. And also, it will be used to evaluate grant applications. And so often for many fields, not actually philosophy, but for many fields, really, if you're going to do research in those fields, you don't just need a position, you need to regularly be winning large grants, large sums of money. And again, the way those grants will be handed out is on the basis of, are you considered impressive? Is your past work considered a sort of a good body of work on which you can be trusted to do more good work? So this quest for credit, this quest to be seen as impressive by the scientists, is a huge part of what motivates what scientists do. And sociologists and historians and economists, and actually some psychologists haven't studied as much, but social scientists have found lots and lots of evidence for this. It's a good model of scientist behavior. And it gives rise to the way we handle the credit economy, the way we sort of distribute this good of honor and esteem, gives rise to this behavior or the slogan, I guess, publish or perish, which you might have heard, which is like the way to be seen to be good, the way to gain credit, the way to gain honor in the eyes of your peers is to publish good work, to be seen as putting your name to papers or books or monographs or talks in the right circumstances, which establish something of interest. And so you have to always be putting work out there in order to be considered like even a potential person to gain credit. That's the only way of really gaining credit in a scientific community. And so, you either do that thing, gain credit, and your career advances, or you don't. And eventually, if you don't have tenure, you're knocked out. And if you do have tenure, you'll be viewed as a kind of as a has-been. Now, that's a bit of a parody. That it's not quite as severe as that, but it can feel that way. And it ain't that much of a parody. Like, there's this really strong pressure to publish, and that's because there's this really strong pressure to, in general, do things which establish yourself as creditworthy, as a good scientist, as worthy of the esteem of your peers as a scientist. And just know that's not tautological, right? Like, for instance, it's perfectly conceptually possible. We could have lived in a world where we rewarded scientists for being really good teachers, or we could have lived in a world where we rewarded scientists for putting a lot of effort into science. Those are perfectly coherent things to do, but we don't. We actually reward you as a scientist or as an academic for being seen to publish ideas. And so, this is a particular way of realizing this idea of credit. And even more particularly, this is kind of Merton's big contribution. He first made really explicit and characterized this thing called the priority rule, which is, it can't just be that you publish ideas, but it has to be new ideas. You have to be, to get credit, to really establish yourself, you need to be seen to be advancing the frontier of knowledge. What you do, it can be an incremental contribution, that'll be less impressive, but that still counts as something. But you do need to be doing something which is like, you're making a new contribution. Like, just reestablishing something by the same means that it's already been established isn't considered that impressive. And I hope when I say that, you can already hear there are going to be problems with replication in that. So you have this kind of, not just that you've got to get ideas out there, you've got to sort of put your name to good work, but also your name needs to be put to good work before other people have had the same idea. And so what happens is, like, this combination of factors where scientists are seeking credit. To get credit, they have to put their name to ideas, and in particular, they need to do it first. The popular sort of theory of fraud, and you'll find this in a bunch of when scientists themselves write about scientific fraud, they tend to lean on a version of what I'm about to say. And there are some books about scientific fraud, for instance, Betrayers of the Truth is considered a classic, and they also tend to adopt this theory. So that sort of the dominant theory of why fraud happens, and often when philosophers say something like that, they're going to knock it down. It's a pretty good theory. I don't dislike it. Is that fraud is caused by the sort of the race, the rat race element that the priority rule, or the credit economy under the priority rule, introduces. Where the thought is that, because the only way I can stay in a scientific game is to publish things before you publish things, I've got this like really strong temptation to cut corners. And if I get data which doesn't quite support what I wanted to support, I have this really strong temptation to do things like alter data points around the edges, or engage in p-hacking, where I sort of torture my data to get something out of it, so the sort of time wasn't wasted. I have a really strong temptation to actually in some cases steal data. I'm not going to talk about as much here. And likewise, I'm really under encouraged to do things like replicate. I'm under encouraged to do things which won't be seen as this by the scientific community as cool. And so I mentioned that journals weren't very interested in publishing replication work, and that was in part because of this priority rule. It was just seen as, it doesn't really count as a contribution to sort of redo something we already know by the same kind of methods. That's not establishing priority on anything interesting, so why would the community care? Again, that's a bit of a caricature, but not as much of a caricature as you'd like, and attitudes are changing a lot now, but until relatively recently, you're talking sort of 2015, that was a very, very common attitude, and it led to a lot of problems. And so the popular theory is just like, we live in a world where there's this credit economy, and it's leading scientists to engage in fraud because they kind of have to, because they're in this rat race. And so, that's what we've got to deal with here. And there is some empirical evidence for this. For instance, if you look at who we catch committing fraud, at least, it very, very often tends to be sort of people on the edge of dropping out of the game altogether. So there'll be people under extreme pressure where, unless you get a publication real soon, like there's no way you're getting another job, or there's no way you're getting another grant. And it seems to be, when asked, and if you look up why they did what they did, it seems like they needed to do this because otherwise they were out. And so it's like that attempt to like get priority, get enough credit to stay in the game, does seem to motivate a lot of fraud. And so that's not all fraud, but it certainly seems to be a factor in many cases. And so there is something to this kind of popular theory of scientific fraud. And right, so if that's your analysis of why we have fraud, if that's the kind of descriptive theory of what causes fraud, which many people have, it is kind of suggestive of a fairly natural fix. And one of the things that interests me is Du Bois, over a century earlier, came to that. Where I should say that modern scientists, as I mentioned, when scientists write about fraud, they will tend to give that kind of analysis of here's what causes fraud, credit seeking, motives other than trying to find the truth, etc. And so the natural thing to do is to say, replace credit seeking with truth seeking. Make scientists the kind of people who want to discover what's true about the world. And it's really interesting to me that W.B. Du Bois came up with a similar suggestion in 1898. So in his essay, The Study of Negro Problems, which was a sort of methodological essay for sociologists studying, I guess the contemporary term would be African Americans, he said that students must be careful to insist that science as such, be it physics, chemistry, psychology, or sociology, has but one simple aim, the discovery of truth. Now, exactly what he's concerned with, in that essay, he mainly mentions rival political motives, but in another essay, he actually explicitly mentions credit seeking as well. He's really concerned that when scientists have motives other than truth seeking, when they're anything other than like the Popperian ideal, it's always a temptation to fraud. And so what we should do is basically use the following fact about science, that we get to we take people in fairly young in their teens, and we get like this intense period of molding them into a culture where in that time we've got really drill into them and insist, in his words, that no, you care only for truth. So it's almost sort of to make a sort of priesthood out of the sciences, right? Like we're really going to work a lot on motive modification. And if you see some contemporary solutions, there's this charmingly titled paper called Scientific Utopia. And in that, the authors, who are social psychologists, they also argue that we need to sort of restructure science such that there aren't these competing incentives to truth seeking, and scientists can just focus on the primary aim, which is truth seeking. And so this kind of sort of psychological modification of the people going into the scientists is, so as far as possible, insist you're only allowed to care about this thing. We're going to filter for people who care about that thing really hard. And just in general, we're going to do everything we can to make scientists these truth seekers. The hope is that just removes the thing which is causing, if not all, then much of the fraud. So it will change the kind of people scientists are, such that they're ones who are less likely to commit fraud. And just, the incredibly cute drawing of Du Bois there, that was by my partner and the love of my life, Yuzi Nakamura. It's just so good. Okay. So how did Du Bois explain and argue for this position? Well, what he tried to do was make a distinction between immediate and the immediate aims of science, where he thought that once people understood this distinction, it would allow them to sort of accept his proposal for this kind of motive modification, for this soul forming, which he thought scientific education should consist in. And I just want to note that there is something interesting about that, because we typically think of the scientific education as learning some facts. You need to learn the established results of a given field, and learning some technical skills. You need to learn how to do certain calculations, make certain kind of experiments, think about how to design experiments, think about how to run certain analyses, or go out into the field, etc. And of course, Du Bois thinks you need to learn all that stuff as well, but he just thinks this is other important element of character formation, or establishing certain virtues in people, in particular being a truth seeker, a very curious person. And he thinks there might be some resistance to this if you don't understand this distinction between the immediate and the immediate aims of science, where the immediate aim is why we engage in the activity at all, what's the purpose of this as an activity. Whereas the immediate aim is what you should be thinking about while you're doing it. Now, there's some recent work on games, and I'm forgetting the name of the author because my mind's going blank because, as I mentioned, I find Zoom talk scary, but which I thought really illustrated this really well when you think about like a game. Let's say you're playing football, real football, not the American one, what you guys would call soccer in your sin. So when you're playing football, right? Like if a group of friends go to the park to play football, then in some sense, the media aim, the reason why you're doing this, all things considered, is to have fun. You know, it's a game, it's a way to pass the time, it's bonding activity, it's something like that. It's a way of having fun with friends. But the immediate aim is in like what the players should be thinking about is probably nothing so like, they shouldn't be thinking at that level when they're playing the game. The players should be thinking about trying to help their team win, doing whatever it takes to use the ball to score goals. That wasn't a very good description of football. It's still better than your one though. Okay, so and that's a sort of like a natural distinction. Is that the ultimate aim of the activity needn't be the thing which it's best for the people involved in the activity to be thinking about. And so for Du Bois, he did think the media aim of science is solving social problems. So he defined social problems as the failure of an organized group to realize its ideals because they can't, take actions which give rise to those ideals being satisfied given their conditions. And he just, what science does is it helps us work out, what can we do with what we've got? How can we get from other places to here? What in general is available to us and what kind of causal powers are out there in the world which we can manipulate to our advantage. And so he does actually think sort of ultimately science is about benefiting the commonweal, about giving us tools which will help guide policy or something like that. And so that's kind of the in the end goal of this activity, is that's kind of social or political purpose. But immediately what the people doing it should be thinking about, I mean, here's his example in social science, is, I like this quote, is the science seeking the limits of chance in human conduct. It's a very sort of poetic way of speaking, but what he means is, under my interpretation, that, the world, we can by studying people carefully, we can see probabilistic social laws. We can see things along the lines of, if a couple get married at this age, they are such and such, they will get divorced with this likelihood. And that kind of information could be very useful to policymakers who are, for instance, concerned with marriage rates. Or you could give information of the sort that, if people have this kind of nutritional education, they have such and such a likelihood of running into these kinds of health problems. And again, that's the kind of thing which can help us guide policy. So the scientists themselves, they shouldn't be thinking about the policy. They should be working out what are those probabilistic social laws, what are the regularities out there in the world which we can discover. That's in the social sciences. It goes the same in physics and chemistry, except they should be looking for chemical or physical laws, respectively. But just in general, the scientists should be trying to work out what's true about the distributions of stuff in nature. And it's really important that they're just focused on that. They're not worried about what's going to be done with this information. They're just trying to tell you about how the world is. And so he anticipated that people might not like scientists becoming these pure truth seekers because they might think, well, hold on, don't we want science to help us do good policy? I want evidence-based policy, which science could help us out with. And he wants to say yeah, we do want that, but it turns out that the way to get that isn't to have the scientists go out and personally be thinking about it. The way is to just insist strictly that the scientists will only think about just what's true, about what's true in their sphere of activity, because in so doing, they'll avoid committing fraud, and we need science to be trusted. That was the point I made earlier. We need science to be trusted for it to play this kind of social role, and they can't do things to discredit the trust of science. And so this is what Du Bois thought. You distinguish between immediate and immediate aim, and you can sort of grant that you have a social purpose in science, and so it has this kind of ethical role in society, but you can still insist that scientists themselves shouldn't be thinking about that thing. And then he sort of also had a bunch of rules about how scientists should communicate, for instance. So he says, A careful student, which of course you should be. So a good student of science discloses the results of individual research with diffidence. I'm actually not sure if that was Du Bois or Du Bois and Eaton, who was a co-author here. But in any case, here the idea is that, scientists have to sort of present their results with the uncertainties made explicit again. So that sort of is another way. If you shouldn't appear overconfident, you shouldn't brag. And this, for the record, is the kind of thing which the credit economy rules against, because you want people to think you've established something new and interesting, and that very much encourages overhyping research results. So Du Bois, you have to insist that because you're concerned with accuracy, not with credit, you're doing things like making clear, the evidence kind of suggests this, but the evidence isn't very strong right now, so you shouldn't be too confident in it. You should be saying things like that regularly, which you won't do if you're just a credit seeker, but you might do if you're a truth seeker, and that's how the world seems to you. And the other thing he thought was really important was triangulation, which I've illustrated with an image here because it's good to break things up and not just give text, like look at that as a picture. Isn't it nice? Good. Okay, so triangulation, which is that he thought we should make sure to use multiple methods. So we should always be checking up on each other's results by you investigate this way and I investigate that way, and then we check to see, that's the triangulation, meet in the middle, to see if we're both getting the same thing. And that way we're ensuring double checking. That's itself a kind of prevention of fraud. That valorizes actually looking at the same kind of thing again. And you should do some of this by the different method consists of a different data set looking towards the same point, analyzed by the same kind of procedures. And so that'd be a kind of form of replication. And so he says you should be doing things to try and check up. That should actually be a valorized activity. Again, because there are good arguments to the effect that this will make it more likely you get things right and you're a truth seeker, that's all you care about. So that's what you do. So, all of this sounds, all of this is kind of pretty directly aimed at the kind of things we've been worried about. This includes provisions for replication. It undercuts the thing which we said have been causing fraud directly. It encourages behaviors which promote honesty, and that's all nice. And so it kind of, if you could make this thing work, it sounds good. Now, you might worry that there's, it might just not be doable. Maybe how good are we at crafting people's souls, right? It might be difficult. But there is a kind of backup in Du Bois's way of arranging things, this is also by Yuzi. I love this picture, which is Du Bois also advocated a very hierarchical way of organizing science, where you have, rather than having incentives struck by we're all trying to publish to get the attention of grant boards or get the attention of our peers in order to impress them, we're sort of organized into research units where there's some leader who is a very trusted, good member of the community. You'll be shocked to learn that Du Bois thought of Du Bois as such a person. They then arrange a lot of research into a fairly definite plan and assign people tasks. And so rather than having the kind of credit incentive to do better and better, you're really just assigned a task in some sense by a trusted figure, and that person's monitoring you. And so if the soul molding doesn't work, the other thing is there's the sword in Leviathan's hand there, which can come down on you. I was going to tell my favorite Du Bois story, just because he really wasn't a humble person. And so my favorite illustration of that is, so Du Bois was actually the first black person to get a PhD from Harvard. And in his later life, when he was working at Atlanta, there's a famous story of he was walking across the quad in Atlanta. He was going back to his office, and a student runs up to him, so a young black man himself, and says, "Oh, Dr. Du Bois, it's such an honor to meet you. You were the first one of us to get a PhD from Harvard. It's such an honor. I'm just so proud. You've done us all so proud." And Du Bois apparently didn't break his stride, and he just coolly looked at the bloke and said, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's," and then went to his office. And this is the kind of man who thinks that he can be Leviathan for science. I can't see your reactions. I'm assuming you're all laughing because my jokes all land when I can't see the audience. Okay, so this is the point. So we got this kind of soul molding project, and this directly attacks a bunch of the causes of fraud, and itself is like monitored in like the way Du Bois would want to organize science. It's like monitored by someone who's a trusted member of the community who can assign tasks in a way which avoids some of the incentive problems which we talked about, and sort of enforces this honesty norm. And so in this way, Du Bois thinks we can, this was Du Bois's solution, like a lot of work to enter character form and then organizing science in such a way that people aren't subject to the same kind of temptations as they are in the current system. And this is, it's not exactly the same as most scientists, but it bears some resemblance. I'll go a bit quicker through the rest. I don't think it works. And I don't think it works for a sort of quite a deep reason, which is that there's just a mistake in this whole way of doing things, is what I worry, at least. It's like the wrong kind of solution. And I say that because, and I will illustrate, I guess, through the idea of noble lies, rather than having let me say a thing and then again read the definition. Where what this approach does, it looks at what's causing fraud now, and then it imagines an intervention, a change we could make, which would get rid of that cause of fraud, and then arranges things appropriately in that world to get good outcomes. But I think that's wrong, because if you're worried about fraud, you shouldn't just look at what's causing fraud in the real world. You need to think, okay, well, if we did implement this change, what would the incentives be then? How would these people behave? How would they respond to the various encouragements and institutional situations they'd find themselves in? And so my worry is that basically it doesn't get rid of fraud. It might just change when you're attempted to commit fraud. So you're not going to commit fraud for credit anymore. Let's assume it works. But there might be other reasons to commit fraud. And this is what got me thinking about the phenomena of noble lies when I'm trying to think through Du Bois's idea. So noble lies occur when a scientist deliberately enters misinformation in scientific literature because they believe that by so doing, they will lead more people to believe the truth. So it's not that they're doing it for credit. They're doing it because they care about, getting the truth out there, letting the truth be known, having the truth be discovered. It just so happens that sometimes it can be better to do that by lies. And I'll give it, this happened historically, right? So there's these really nice cases where there was a time in the past where this kind of lying wasn't actually really considered bad behavior, as a scientist could just admit to it. And so we find in early modern botany, so this is when Europeans were going to South America, and there's obviously a lot of new plant life in areas like Brazil, and they were cataloging what they find. And the scientists would send back samples and describe the samples, but they would include in prefaces to their work, they would say things like, yeah, a lot of the samples I found, they were sort of like weird in various ways. They'd been chewed on by animals or whatever. And so don't worry, I corrected the observations and I made it, and I've drawn you a picture and described it how it should have looked. And then the idea was that kind of what it means to be a sort of expert botanist is the ability to see like what kind of deviations or weird features of the sample you have, which are like sort of unrepresentative. And so you sort of correct the data set in this way, but you can admit to doing it because everyone expects you to do that. That's what they think your job is. And I think that, that kind of temptation to commit noble lies, that hasn't gone away. It's just you can't admit to that anymore in contemporary science. And I think a truth seeker would be perfectly well incentivized to do that, because if you just thought that if I present you something about my data or the experiment I just did was misleading, or it was a really unlikely event which just happened to occur this time or something like that, then I might really think that if I give you the truth, it will lead to you believing false things. If I honestly describe my experiment, it will trick you because you're not as sophisticated as I am if I'm the expert scientist doing this, and so you might be misled by it. And so these kind of noble lies are a thing which have in the past encouraged scientists to commit fraud, and they could do so again. And so I even worry, and here's the COVID connection, and this is a slightly complicated case because it's about sort of a moral matter rather than a straightforwardly scientific matter. But I really, really strongly suspect that when the dust is settled and we can do inquiries into sort of dispassionate historical research, we'll find that in the early stages of 2020, when a number of public health experts were claiming that masks do not protect against COVID, I honestly think it's going to be found that what they thought was that something along the lines of the public should not wear masks is true. It's true for good reason. It's true. And even maybe something like if the public wear masks, there'll be more spread of COVID. And they thought that for the good reason, which is that there was limited supply, and there was very, very good reason to try and concentrate that supply on with doctors or with people who are going to be working with especially vulnerable groups, etc. They did have good reason to think that was true. But they also thought that if they explained their reason for rationing these things, we just wouldn't actually get the rationing. Oh, thank you very much, my darling. And so what they did instead was they told a noble lie. They said something which I don't think they believed, which was that the masks won't do anything to stop transmission for you. And in that way encouraged what they took to be the good result. That's why I suspect, obviously that's speculative at this point, but it would be an example of this kind of noble lie, and albeit a slightly complicated one. And these noble lies, even if there's only a few people telling them, they can really propagate, because in a typical scientific situation, you can have lots of different scientists doing lots of things. It's the division of labor. Just there's always like many different scientists working in many different areas, and they can't do everything themselves. They've got to learn from each other as to what the results of those other things are. That's just a natural thing. And sometimes those results will conflict, and that's what we kind of expect. And so ultimately we hope to get at the truth by sort of aggregating over many of these activities. That's why we do meta surveys or like review articles where we try and see not just what any one scientist is saying, what's the overall body of evidence. That's good. That's a normal process. There's nothing bad about the fact that scientists are working on slightly different approaches and learning from each other, and ultimately sometimes contradicting each other, but in a way which we hope to learn from in the long run. But this can lead to problems, right? So in the good case, the no fraud world, if you imagine that, so the idea is the blue sign, the color of the circle is sort of like what result they got. They're testing a thing, it can be blue or red. And the arrows, if there's an arrow pointing to you, what that means is you learned from the thing it came from. And so you can imagine in this world, there's the scientist on, I guess, my left, I hope that's your left too. The first blue scientist from which the arrows go, they get a result, it says blue. The second person does the work, they read the first person's work, does their own experiment, they also get blue. The third person reads the other two people's work, but they get red, no fraud, they they conclude red. And so the sort of the total information stream would be something like this. We have evidence for blue, but it's not conclusive. There were some counterfeiting studies. But if you imagine a world where we're all good truth seekers, we just want the truth to be known, want the truth to be out there might be a kind of temptation for the person at the end there, right? Because if they read the previous two works, they might get the impression, oh, it's the thing is very likely to be blue. And of course, if not just two studies, suppose there've been a whole bunch of studies which early on suggested that we're in the world where blue is the correct answer. In that kind of situation, then they're really going to be tempted to lie. And so, this is based on a previous work on information cascades. And so what you might get in that world is they themselves will fudge the data, not because they're trying to get glory out of it or anything like that, but because they think that if they were to publish red, that would mislead people, and really their experiment was misleading. If they're right about that, it might even be that this is the best way of encouraging more people to believe the truth. But you can imagine really bad cases, and this is what often information cascades are concerned with, where let's suppose the first few results were the misleading ones, and it's just, if we'd have done inquiry after, it would have looked like red was actually the overwhelmingly more likely one. We just got unlucky with an early series of misleading results. That also happens in science. They can talk about examples if you're interested. Now, in that case, we'd end up with a totally misleading record, because everyone would look at the previous work and think it's really likely we live in the blue world, and it's just my work which is misleading. And to get this like runaway information cascade, this runaway fraud, all just from one or two people at the wrong moment doing this kind of noble lie fraud. This is possible. There have been cases which look pretty similar. So I really don't think we have reason to think that this world in which we have the benevolent overlord who just wants us to know the truth and is assigning tasks to ensure the truth is out, that person, they could be as truth-seeking as we like. It could be totally successful. We put them in charge because we really have soul molded them into a good Du Boisian truth seeker. But there's still this kind of fraud, noble lie fraud, which can occur and which can have really bad effects. And so I'm not yet really persuaded that the case has been made for like the Du Boisian intervention. And as I said, Du Bois just got there first. Many people nowadays are promoting basically similar interventions. And so this isn't just a historical proposal that I think is wrong, but something which I worry about in a lot of contemporary work. And yeah, and so I take the upshot to be, you know, we need good institutions, not saints ruled by benevolent tyrants. We need to find some way of ensuring that without trying to just make the people have the right kind of motives, we instead design things such that they're just whatever, such that it's relatively insensitive to their motives, and yet they won't be encouraged to commit fraud or get away with it if they do. And it's even worth thinking about what get away with it means. We'll talk about that later. I think often the focus on punishing bad people might be the wrong approach. We can discuss that if you're interested. So yeah, I think the Du Boisian answer, I'm worried that it's just the wrong kind of answer, that just changing people's motives will just change when they want to commit fraud. There's no way of making it such that there's no incentive to commit fraud. In fact, I worry with these noble lies, these have happened, and so we have good reason to think people will commit fraud for this reason. And instead we need to think about what a good institution will be. But I haven't told you what those are. And this is the bit where I'm hoping the youth are inspired. They're writing down, you know, plans for like the fraud-free world, the real scientific utopia. They're all going out to institution design because they're so inspired by my talk. Please try and give me just most of the credit, not all of it, when you do that, if you're so inspired. And you know, I don't have an answer. Like, I don't know how we do this. Like, scientific fraud, I think, is a big problem. I think it's underplayed a bit in some of the literature on this. I think, as in the COVID-19 case, if I'm right about that, then it can often have kind of really disastrous effects. Because you know, there is now a mask skeptic movement, and I think it's not unrelated to seeing the experts go back and forth on themselves in this way. And you know, I don't know how we reach the good world from here, but I think it's important. And so I just, you know, I hope this talk encourages people to think about scientific fraud, what causes it, what might solve it. And I think like the most popular theory as to why it happens is pretty good, but it's very popular way of responding, which I think is, which I explored through W.B. Du Bois, but which is, I think he's just a very well thought out version of a general idea. I don't necessarily think it's successful. Okay, so you know, what questions do you have for me? What feedback? That's the end of the talk. I hope everything's okay.
Well, great, Liam. Thank you for the talk. I'm pulling up the gallery view. Can people actually clap and turn off their mics? No? Okay, good, thank you.
I got this slide. I got it from Aaron Novick, a philosopher at wherever he's at. And so I just want to keep it up because I love it so much. This is my end of talk slide. Okay, so what questions do people have?
So there's a question in the chat, but I'll let Yulia go first. Yulia, do you want to?
Okay, just before we go, remember the most important rule, which is everyone has to be nice to me or I'll be sad. Okay.
And I will say, Liam, I was laughing at your jokes. So I don't know about the rest of them.
I'm just knowing that
me
you're
too,
out.
but you couldn't hear me because I was muted.
Okay, good. Okay, Yulia.
Okay, so I was also laughing at your jokes and enjoying your talk. So thank you very much. But I'm afraid that I have kind of a prosaic question that may be more for, like, you know, political scientist or not for like a philosopher, because you made all those, you know, excellent points. But my prosaic question is, what about the role of funding in scientific fraud? And I don't mean if there is no strictly monetary motivation to make a fraud, it will go away. It will be all this credit economy and everything that you discussed. But my impression is that for now, it may be even maybe the main motivator. And if I can give a couple examples, everyone knows about all those economics departments basically funded by Koch brothers and other like business interests with like charitable donations, or a number I recently came across. psychotropic drugs that actually are difficult to evaluate for a number of reasons. Kind of clinical trials are even more difficult for them than for other drugs. So clinical trials funded by pharmaceutical companies show positive results, show that the drug works 5 times more than publicly university-funded trials. Then most trials, of course, most research is funded by pharmaceutical companies. So then we have, like, you know, this scientific consensus that a certain drug works. So do you have any thoughts on this funding problem?
Oh, certainly, I have lots of thoughts. It's a great point. Thank you for the question. Yes, a huge source of scientific fraud is a combination of things. Firstly, there's straightforward instances of people just being paid to lie by rich people. So that can happen through some corporate funding, that can happen through the special centers set up by rich individuals, like, you know, the Koch brothers Foundation for Freedom, Liberty, and Why Pinochet Was Good, actually. And like you get these kind of organizations, and they're totally untrustworthy in that case. There are also more subtle or nefarious means besides just direct payments to lies, through which industry often can bring about that there's false results. And so if anyone's interested in this, there's a really great accessible book called The Misinformation Age by Kaylin O'Connor and Jim Weatherall, which is about that. And then there's also been a recent study by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. The name I'm forgetting, but it's a very good study of the way the tobacco industry managed to undercut research into the link between smoking and cancer, and how those strategies were then adopted by the natural resources like oil and gas into research on climate change. So this is a huge source of scientific fraud. I certainly didn't mean to say anything inconsistent with that. Now, I think it requires, I mean, so the sort of things I was looking at here, I said this a few times, but I should be more explicit about it. I'm thinking of sort of like, it's not totally divorced from it, but that's industry science. I'm sort of, I view to be its own thing with separate problems, and this talk, I didn't really intend to be about that. As to what could be done about it, so acknowledging it's a huge problem, as to what could be done about it, well, I should, perhaps a relevant bit of information is this talk was initially planned to be last week, but we decided to make it today because the thought was it would be better to give the talk when everyone knew who the next president was and we'd all calm down about it, like jokes on us, right? Not knowing about the political situation in your fine country, I don't judge how you decide to run it, and knowing that Zoom has low security, I'm not sure how much I want to say. Just what you might want to think about how much large-scale industrial capitalism and honest research into various features of the natural and social world are consistent. I think there might be deep tensions between organizing society in the kind of very hierarchical way which gives a certain class of people a lot of power to distribute resources, and in particular distribute resources into what inquiry is done. That might just be a fundamentally bad thing for doing many kinds of research. And in lieu of a general solution to that problem, we might at least want to consider ways in which we could kind of more strictly cut off or divorce or separate scientific research funding from industry funding. There'd be trade-offs there because industry is so rich, they can bring a lot of resources in, but it's a thing we need to think about. It's for another talk though, I don't have full comments on it now. I hope that ramble helped. Thank you, Yulia.
Thanks, Liam. And it's certainly an important thing since industry outfunds public funding for science in the United States by like 3 to 1. So certainly a good question. But so Janet had a question in the chat, so I'll just read it out loud. She asked, isn't the noble lie the manifestation of a Platonist impulse of the sort that also drives physical scientists to look for the curve that best fits the data on the assumption that that curve, rather than the real data with inescapable errors, is a better representation of the real phenomena? And so couldn't shifting to incentivizing efforts to test results rather than just reporting novel results act as a reasonable check on this impulse? Because the pool of replicators are collectively open to the idea that the real phenomena could be more complicated than initially assumed.
Good. Yeah, so I picked the name to be sort of suggestive of the Platonic connection. And you know, it's tempting for me to say there is some kind of, for just the reason you say, that there's some kind of connection to a certain kind of realism, because exactly what has to be going on for this to seem plausible to you is that, you know, somehow, like, the results, like my observations, the evidence I've gathered is somehow not representative of a real truth underlying it. And that gap has to exist for the noble life to be a sort of sensible thing. And so a sort of very strict empiricist of a certain sort might not be tempted to make that kind of error. I'm just very wary, though, of using that as a basis for any kind of policy against this, because it doesn't seem like a good idea to try and put it this way, maybe if scientists feel inclined to be that kind of Platonic realist after doing their studies on the basis of what they think about their subject, I think that's kind of, I don't separate out that sort of metaphysical assumption from the science itself so strictly. I think that's part of their work. And I worry there'll be a sort of undue restriction to just rule out or discourage that kind of Platonism because we don't like its social effects. If, you know, if scientists become convinced that kind of Platonism is true, I think they should be able to conclude as much and do their research on that basis. And so while I do think there is a link there, I'm wary of deploying that link as a sort of anti-fraud mechanism.
Okay. So Snezna, do you want me to read your question or do you want to just ask it out loud? So you've got your video up as well.
It helps to have a microphone. Liam, this was fantastic, really thought-provoking and inspiring. I sent some students in my cell biology class to listen to this, and I think they're going to find it meaningful. Thank you so much. But at the risk of offending someone somewhere, are there gender differences in this context of scientific fraud? I hold, or I could hold that women have traditionally been more concerned just about getting things just done, just get them done rather than try to make sure that they get the credit and recognition. Has that in any way translated in the frequency of, you know, the kind of transgressions you would have paid attention to?
So I'm going to kind of give an excuse, which is I'm not, there has been work on this and I just can't remember. I remember reading a paper which was about this and I can't remember what the paper concluded.
Really? Yeah.
But I'm going to also say, I actually think that sociological data on fraud is actually pretty bad because, I mean, for obvious reasons, it's sociological data on who gets caught. And I don't necessarily think that is representative. And so you'll often hear people say fraud is very rare, but they don't really have good grounds for saying that thing. And when I look at things like the replication crisis, I think actually there was just a lot of intentional misbehavior underlying it. And so what I'd say is I don't think we really know the distribution of who's committing fraud, and so we can't say this thing. I do have one slight reason to kind of expect it to be gendered, which is related to the unequal status of men and women, I guess, in broader society, but in science in particular, which is that there are a number of like more theoretical studies of fraud, which kind of suggest the conclusion that we should expect more fraud, albeit undetected fraud, from people who are like higher up the hierarchy, who are sort of more influential. That's gendered in science, so men are a higher proportion of named chairs and things like that than women. And so that for that reason, I would therefore expect there to be that gives me some reason to expect there to be some kind of gender skew with men committing more fraud. But that's obviously, you know, that's very speculative and theoretical. And my real answer is, I just think our present sociological data is pretty bad and people massively undercount fraud. So I can't say distribution. It's a good question, though. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we have time for 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So Taylor, do you want to go, and then after that we can have Michael go?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just threw something in there because, you know, I'm more of a social scientist and a political scientist than a philosopher. But I was just sort of reiterating what Subhashish and Janet pointed out, that there's two ways to go at this, right? We can focus at individual scientists and say, how do we make these individual scientists better in their conduct? Or we say, well, how can we change the system so that fraud and other kinds of forms of research misconduct are more quickly uncovered or addressed, you know, whether that's through incentivizing replication studies or whatever else. We're not so worried about, you know, science being tainted by fraud, but we're just have a system that uncovers and tries to get rid of it more quickly.
Yeah, no, so those are sort of two things which is exactly as you say. And I think, for instance, Du Bois, he wanted a bit of both, but he was very focused on the individual. He did want institutional changes, but those were basically to put the right individuals in place to enforce their better motivations. Now, there's not, of course, a total dichotomy between these things. They'd have to feed into each other. But I lean more towards the kind of institutional changes for that reason. And in fact, I'll use what you said to riff of one of my themes. One of the things I think is a mistake is I think detecting fraud is kind of less important than uncovering falsehoods or mistakes. It doesn't really matter why someone ended up putting a falsehood into the stream of science, so long as we can catch them and get rid of them. Now, fraud seems to have this notion of like intent or something like that wrapped up in it, and that makes it harder to catch. And that also means that it makes allegations of fraud kind of higher stakes, and so I think they happen more rarely. I think just much more work on incentivizing replication or work which is kind of sort of constantly checking and rechecking what we're taking for granted would be a good kind of structural change. And that might come with a sort of de-emphasis on a sort of moralized inquiry into particular individuals and what they're up to. So that would be my take. It's a good point. Thank you.
Good. And Liam, just to clarify, you're critical of Du Bois because he put himself as the kind of philosopher king. And obviously you think that you would be the better philosopher king, and that's the main take home, correct?
I don't think I'm critical of Du Bois of that. It's pretty jokes, in the end, what matters is being funny, and it was a funny thing of him to do. So I support it.
Excellent. Okay, and then Michael, do you want to share?
Cheers, thank you. Hi Liam, thank you for a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask about, particularly in the Du Boisian model, where he sits as the Leviathan at the top of the scientific hierarchy. And I've asked a similar question to you before in a different context, more about your work on Du Bois, about the relationship between the sort of ideological content of scientific knowledge and the idea that we want to turn people into truth seekers. We've already seen truth be like co-opted as like a right-wing buzzword against like any attempt to like critically approach scientific knowledge, and that any like I'd say a feminist empiricist approach would say that like depending on the values that scientific practitioners use in their pursuit of truth, there's going to be ideological content embedded in it that shapes the sorts of conclusions that we come to about the world. I know for you, Du Bois's answer would be like, I would simply get the ideology right. I would get our set of concepts right in the first place. I was just wondering how you think the institutional approach would go about administering the gap between trying to legislate out fraud by making people better at seeking truth and less responsive to the credit economy, but like not turning them into people who would be resistant to like critical approaches to the sorts of new things we value, if that's truth or something similar.
Yeah. So Du Bois, this is a thing which Du Bois actually thought about a lot. So he sort of really thought that one of the good uses of properly done social science would be that it would help dissuade people of ideological illusions or delusions. And so he thought a lot about how they might influence the science themselves. And it relates really to the kind of hierarchical model of inquiry he had, what he thought should be done about it, where he basically envisions a kind of a division of labor of some sort, where there are some people who are specialists in thinking about like what kind of goals we should be pursuing, what sort of worldview or desirable ethical outlook we should have. And those people should be informing the scientists as to what they should be up to. And so there should be some interplay between what those people think and what the scientists do. But the scientists, are more or less to like do as they're told. They're worker bees. They're to do as they're told by the, as he would sometimes use the word seers, he would sometimes use the word prophets, by the people who are tasked with the more normative bit of inquiry. And for their part, just worry about, whatever tasks they're assigned, getting it right. And so it's not that he thought that the scientists should be receptive to the right kind of ideological critique because he thought they were sort of experts in thinking about what ideology we should have. And it's not like we're going to settle that straight away. That's itself a continual process of inquiry, and he thought about how that should be done. But but that would be the relationship. Now, I think this is just subject to a pretty similar worry as the organization of science more generally, right? Which is concentrating that kind of activity in the hands of the people Du Bois assures us are a moral elite is no more reassuring than concentrating power in anyone else's hands. So I wouldn't endorse that solution, but I think that would be Du Bois's solution. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. So I'll give the last question to Nora, because I think she had a short question that would be worth asking. Nora, do you want to ask?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry to run over time. Hi, Liam. How's it going?
Is that your question?
No. My question is, so you argue that Du Bois's approach isn't going to work, and in large part because of the noble lies. And I'm wondering, if we're in the business of soul crafting already and making the scientists into curious truth seekers, couldn't we just also make them into truth tellers too? And
yeah. So that's not impossible. So I think the idea of the noble lies isn't just themselves, but my worry is like this overall approach to thinking about what should be done with fraud. Wait, I didn't answer your first question. I'm fine, Nora. I hope you're well too. Long time no see. But I think that it's not just the particular problem that, okay, with this truth seekers, there already be noble lies. Now you might then try and firefight, or what's that American phrase? You put a band-aid over this by by fixing, okay, fine. Well, we'll motivate their motives to get rid of that motivation too. But I think no, because what you're doing there is you're still focusing on what's causing fraud in this situation and stopping that thing. Well, you can do that forever, and then it will just be the job of some new social scholar to work out what's going to incentivize fraud in a new scenario. The issue fundamentally is with thinking about fraud in terms of stopping the current causes of fraud, rather than trying to think about, I just need to design a system where once you're into that system, here are what the incentives are, here's how you're moving around. That may or may not involve soul crafting in this kind of way. I don't know, but I think that's the way you need to be thinking about it, rather than firefighting each particular cause of whack-a-moling causes of fraud as they come up. Good. Thanks, Nora. I hope you're well. I like you. You're good.
All right. Well, if y'all will join me in thanking Dr. Bright for giving us such a thought-provoking talk. If you'll please unmute yourself and we can final.
Thank you, Liam.
All right. Well, that's everything we have for y'all today. Thank you for coming. We're going to upload the recording to YouTube as well. So if you want to share it with other people, feel free to. Otherwise, I hope you'll have an excellent afternoon, or for those of you across the ocean, morning or evening. So take care, and we'll hope to see you at the next talk.
All right. Have a good day. Thanks for the meeting / show / whatever the heck this was.
Okay. Bye.